Hey everyone, welcome to the Raw Time-Lapse Workflow Tutorial Extended. What we're going to be doing here today is taking a time-lapse shot from beginning to completion. We're going to give you all the steps that you will need to fully utilize the power of Camera Raw in your time-lapse photography. Some of you may be wondering why you should choose RAW over JPEG. The overall reason that I give you is this: the power shooting in RAW can give you during post-production. RAW can save you from errors that may occur during shooting, using an improper white balance, having an over or underexposed shot, or similar errors. Now, it can't fix everything, but choosing to shoot your time-lapses in Camera Raw is going to allow you much greater flexibility when you're adjusting picture exposure and trying to recover detail that JPEG simply can't offer you. For those of us who cannot afford expensive glass just yet, the options RAW offers you to enhance your shot can become compelling quite quickly. Simply put, shooting in JPEG results in everything being baked in, while shooting in RAW allows you many non-destructive adjustments in post-production that can give you more bang for very little buck. Before we get started or go anywhere, there's going to be a few pieces of equipment that we'll need. Other than your camera, the next piece of gear you're going to need is going to be your intervalometer. Today I'll be using one from Canon, but we'll have links to others in the video description.
A tripod is essential for a steady time lapse. Use what you have, but you won't regret investing in a quality tripod.
Our Stingray Very ND filter here is going to help us control our exposure to get the optimum camera settings that we want. Be careful when choosing an ND filter, as some of the cheaper ones can result in a nasty color shift. Next, you'll need a lens cloth or other method for cleaning your lenses. Definitely clean your lenses before going out to shoot, but always check the lens and clean it before you start shooting. Also, be sure you have gaff tape on set. It's absolutely essential to have enough batteries and memory cards for your shot. Make sure before you ever get out to the field that the memory cards you plan on using are okay to be formatted and your batteries are fully charged. Since you are shooting in Camera Raw, be prepared to use up a lot more space on your cards and hard drives. Now, some of you may be wondering why we didn't talk about lenses during our gear prep. The reason for that is actually quite simple. Even though I already chose the appropriate lens for this time lapse, I bring all my lenses just in case the focal length that I chose doesn't work out for whatever reason. Having all my lenses gives me a variety of focal lengths to choose from, thereby not limiting my options. Before we set our camera, I wanted to show you the power of this Stingray ND fader. Now, as you can see, the shot is completely blown out and way overexposed. And the Stingray ND filter that I have right now is at minimum, but when I dial it up, you can clearly see how much it darkens the picture. As we set our camera, the goal is to avoid flicker. When setting your iris or f-stop, avoid f16 to f22. Not only can it bring flicker into your time lapse, but it can bring out any crap that may be on your camera sensor. When setting your shutter speed, avoid anything above 1/100th of a second. When setting your ISO, just know that higher numbers are going to mean your camera is more sensitive to light. When you go above ISOs like 800, usually there's a varying amount of noise introduced into the picture, so keep that in mind. Inside your camera is a mirror that can cause possible flicker in your time lapse. This mirror is how you view your shot through the optical viewfinder. There are two different ways to eliminate flicker here. The first is to simply enable live preview, as I've done so here. This flips the mirror up, preventing possible light leak through your viewfinder. The other method is to put gaff tape over your viewfinder. If you own a lower end DSLR such as a T2i, I recommend using the gaff tape method. So we set our camera here to an f-stop of 8, 1/80th of a second shutter speed, and 100 ISO. To get a proper exposure using these settings, our Stingray ND fader here is crucial. Before you proceed, make sure your white balance is set to anything but auto. Check your focus and make sure it is on manual, not auto. That is guaranteed to ruin your shot. The last thing we need to do is set our intervalometer. I'm going to set my intervals here to 3 seconds. This chooses how many seconds are between each shot. Next, long on our intervalometer chooses how long we need per shot. This is our exposure time, and I'm going to set my exposure here to 1 second. You're never going to need to do anything different unless you're doing long exposure work, such as an astro time lapse. Lastly, set how many frames you want the camera to shoot. I'm going to leave it set on 00, which is infinity on this Canon intervalometer. Now that we're all set to shoot, I'm going to start my time lapse, and I'll see you in the edit suite. The first thing we're going to do is copy over our pictures. I already have a time-lapse folder ready to go, but just as a rule of thumb, organize your assets by their type, and it'll be a lot easier for you to find things whenever you do need them during your project. I'm going to go ahead and create a 01 folder. Click on the first picture. Shift-click the last one. Drag it over, make sure it's going into the right folder, and then let go. As you can see, I have a lot of underscores in my folder naming structures, and the reason for that is simply because After Effects does not deal well with spaces in folder names. So if I had a space here instead of an underscore, After Effects would have a hard time coping with that. You may get several different types of error messages, so just save yourself some trouble and either add underscores in your folder names or just have no spaces at all. It's really up to you. While our pictures are copying over, I also wanted to talk about the programs that we're going to be using today. You're going to need Bridge, Adobe After Effects, and LRTimelapse. If you're not familiar with LRTimelapse, you can find it at LRTimelapse.com. It's actually not a plugin for Lightroom, though it does work really well with Lightroom. It also works well with Bridge, and is actually a standalone program and not a software plugin. It's been provided by a German developer named Gunther Wegner. It is free, though if you do like it, I highly suggest that you donate to Gunther so you can keep the development of this program going. It's a great program for deflickering your time lapses, but you can also keyframe changes over time, such as white balance and a lot of different properties that we're going to talk about later. Another option for deflickering your time lapses I wanted to tell you about is GB Deflicker from Granite Bay Software. You can find it at granitebaysoftware.com. It's a great option for removing flicker. Personally, I've never used it, but I know a lot of people that swear by it, and if you're looking for something that has a little tighter integration with After Effects and Premiere Pro, definitely check it out. It's available for CS4 all the way to CS 5.5. And they do have a free trial, so you can see whether you like it or not. And one other website that I wanted to call attention to is timescapes.org. It's a website run by Tom Lowe, who's currently working on his feature film Timescapes. The time-lapse forum on Timescapes is pretty much the best one I've ever been to. The community is very welcoming, very knowledgeable, and the I'm New to Time-Lapse forum is pretty much the best place you can go if you are in fact new to time-lapse. When I first started learning about time-lapse, this is where I went to, and this is where I learned about a lot of the beginning concepts that we're going to be talking about. So definitely check it out and join up with the community. I'm sure they'd love to have you. Now that our pictures have been copied over, I'm going to eject the card. The next thing we're going to do is come over here to Finder, go all the way to the bottom, shift-click the last picture, go ahead and hit spacebar, and normally I would use Preview on my Mac here to check every single frame on my time-lapse. What I check for when I go through all these pictures is mistakes that may have happened. The camera got bumped, a bird flew too close to the frame, anything like that. I've already checked all my frames though, so I'm going to go ahead and close Preview. And our next step is to open Adobe Bridge. I'm going to navigate to my Projects folder here. Kessler Timelapse.
time lapses, 0, 1. As you can see, Bridge has loaded up thumbnails for all the different pictures that we took for our time lapse. The first thing to do here with these thumbnails is to click on the first picture in our sequence, go ahead and right click, open in Camera Raw. The first thing we should notice is the white balance. I'm going to come down here to Auto just to show you. Sometimes Camera Raw gets it right, but in this case it's chosen 6000 Kelvin, which is a little bit warmer than what I need, so I'm going to try Daylight, which is still a little bit warmer than what I want it to be. So I'm going to go back to As Shot and go ahead and crank it up to about 5300 Kelvin. The next thing we should take note of is exposure. Now, our Stingray ND fader allowed us to get a pretty even exposure, so I'm going to move on down to recovery. The first place you should look to find any type of recovery where it's actually bringing back some of that detail is high contrast areas with a lot of light and shadow, such as these rocks down here. Recovery works great on clouds, especially ones that may be a little more blown out than you would like. So definitely use recovery as much as you can, but don't crank it up all the way. I'm going to go ahead and leave it at about 71, and I'm going to come down here to Fill Light purely to warn you not to use it. Fill Light can be pretty gross looking, especially when you crank it up to numbers like 50 or anything like that. What it's trying to do is fill in areas where light did not exist before, aka shadows. So if you look down here at these rocks, there's a lot less contrast in there, and if we zoom in on these trees, we can see that Fill Light has completely just ruined them, and it doesn't look good, introduces a lot of noise, it's just a bad deal all around. So the only thing I can tell you about Fill Light is either don't use it or use it sparingly, because it can be really dicey really fast. I'm going to leave blacks, brightness, and contrast alone, and I'm going to come right down here to clarity. Clarity is actually the same as contrast, it just introduces contrast into only the midtones of the image. So when I crank it up here to about 50, you can see immediately there's a lot more contrast and perceived detail on these rocks. Now, it's not actually bringing out any detail in them other than adding contrast in only the midtones portion of the image, and that usually brings itself out in areas like these trees up here or the rocks down here. If I go the other way with clarity, you can see it gives it almost kind of a diffuse kind of effect, glowy, not really what we want, so I'm going to take it back up to 50. And I'm going to come down here to vibrance. Now, vibrance and saturation are the same as their interfaces might give away, but the main difference here with vibrance, as with clarity, is vibrance is saturation, but only in the midtones of the image. If I bring up the saturation, like, say, to 87, we can see that it looks crazy saturated on every part of the image, from the highlights all the way to the shadows. So I'm going to bring that back down here to 0. And you can see when I crank up the vibrance, it's a little less gaudy than increasing the saturation to absurd levels. So usually I like to use vibrance to give the sky a little more blue or what have you. So definitely play with these settings. You may not want to introduce that much saturation right off the bat. It's really up to you. The other tab I wanted to call attention to here is the Detail tab. Detail is where noise reduction is located and is really handy if you're doing something like a long exposure time lapse, an astro time lapse, anything where you know your images are going to have a lot of noise. Definitely head right over here to the Detail tab. Now that we're done, I'm going to go down here and click Done. As you can see, both the thumbnail and the preview window have updated with the changes that we just made in the Camera Raw dialog box. I'd like to also point out that all these changes that we've made are completely non-destructive. Anything that we want to change in the future is definitely available to change. If you want to throw out everything and start from scratch, all you need to do is come over here to Finder, go to the top, and you can see that there's a new file here called an XMP file. XMP files are where Adobe Bridge is storing all the metadata of the changes that we've just made. So if you want to start fresh, just delete the XMP file and you're good to go. The next step in this process is to right-click that first picture, come down here to Develop Settings, copy Settings, click the second picture in your sequence, shift-click the last picture, go ahead and right-click any of the selected pictures, come back down to Develop Settings, Paste Settings. The first thing you're going to see is the Paste Camera Raw Settings dialog box. And the first thing you're going to notice is how many different options we have for customizing what we want to copy to the other pictures. We don't need to change anything, so I'm just going to go ahead and click OK. Before we deselect any of these pictures, I want to call your attention to bit depth 16. That's going to be important later, and I'll explain when we get to Adobe After Effects. Go ahead and deselect the pictures. All you need to do is click anywhere in the gray area. The next thing I want to call your attention to is the thumbnail extractions down here on the left. Now, what it's doing here is updating all these thumbnails for our time-lapse sequence. If you decide to quit Adobe Bridge before these are done, sometimes there can be errors with LRTimelapse and missing metadata, so I definitely recommend that you do not quit Adobe Bridge until these thumbnails are done updating. Now that all of our thumbnails have updated, go ahead and quit Adobe Bridge. The next program we're going to be opening is LRTimelapse. The first thing I want you to do is come over here to Volumes. Volumes are hard drives. I'm going to navigate down to my Projects folder. Once you do navigate to your folder that your time-lapse pictures are located, the first thing that LRTimelapse is going to do is read all the metadata that we just copied over in Adobe Bridge. Now that LRTimelapse has loaded all the metadata from our pictures, I want you to go all the way down to the bottom, make sure the first picture is selected, and then go ahead and shift-click on the last picture. The next thing you're going to want to do is check the deflicker box. We are taking these steps just as a precautionary measure. We did take all those different steps to reduce flicker while we were in the field shooting. If you have really bad flicker, if you forgot to do any of those steps, I definitely recommend moving up the strength and the smoothing properties. You may not get it right the first time, but there's only been one instance that I've run into where LRTimelapse could not cure my flicker woes. So definitely experiment with those properties. Don't be afraid to take it all the way up to 20 if you have bad flicker. LRTimelapse can definitely help you out. If you come over here to Transitions, I'm just going to choose Auto simply because all we're doing is deflickering. If you come up here and you see all these different categories, you'll notice that these are the options that we had when we were in the Camera Raw dialog box. And you can keyframe these different changes between the first picture and the last picture. If you do keyframe anything, you probably will not want to choose Auto simply because it might not look the best, or you want a more stylized transition. Definitely play around with eased and linear. There's also a lot of different options here as far as choosing your transition, so definitely check those out. Since we're done, our last step here is going to be to save it. Go ahead and hit OK. go ahead and quit LRTimelapse. The next program we're going to be opening here is Adobe After Effects. The first thing I want you to do is come up here to After Effects, go to your Preferences, Import, next, come down here to Sequence Footage. What that means is every image sequence that you bring into After Effects is going to have this frame rate regardless of whatever frame rate you set for your composition. So if you needed to have a different frame rate, say like 30 frames per second, this is where you would do it first, before you import anything. I don't need to change this, so I'm just going to hit OK. Come over here to the project window, right-click, Import, File. I'm going to come over here to the first picture in my time-lapse sequence. Go ahead and click it. Next thing it's going to say is Format, Camera Raw, Import As, Footage, Camera Raw Sequence. Go ahead and hit Open. The next thing it's going to bring up is the Camera Raw dialog box that we already messed with back in Adobe Bridge. So we're going to go ahead and hit OK. Next, come down to Create a New Composition. Go ahead and click it. I'm going to name mine Timelapse Tutorial. I'm going to leave the width and the height alone. It's 1920 by 1080 with an aspect ratio of square pixels. It's got the same frame rate. I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. Next, to import your image sequence into your composition, just click, drag, and let go. As you can see here, our time lapse is actually between 20 and 21 seconds. So I'm going to go ahead and trim the work area down so we don't have any blank frames. Next, go ahead and save your project. And I'm just going to call it Timelapse Tutorial. As you can see in our main composition window here, our full frame is not yet available to us, and that's because our scale, if you come down here and hit S, it's going to bring up the scale. Our scale is at 100%. And the reason for that is simply because the images that we shot are actually more than 5,000 pixels wide, and our composition is 1080p, but it's still effectively a 2 megapixel picture. What that allows us to do is have a lot of freedom with reframing our shot or animating a move over time. I'm going to come down here to the scale, click on it, and change it to 37.1%. Now we have the full width of our pictures available to us, and if I zoom out just a little bit more, you can see that we have a lot of headroom with reframing our shot on the y-axis. Come back down here, hit P for position, and I'm actually going to crop the sky out just a little bit more due to the fact that there is no clouds in the sky, literally nothing that's going to give us a sense of a passage of time like the shadows on the trees or the shadows on the rocks here would give us. Next, I'm going to come over to the Effects and Presets window here, and I'm going to bring the Curves effect over to our layer, and I'm just going to create a simple little S-curve. This is going to make for a much punchier image, has a lot of contrast and perceived saturation. If I turn it off, the image seems a bit flatter than when I enable it. Next, I'm going to come back to the Effects and Presets window, type in Unsharp, and I'm going to drag the Unsharp mask over to our layer here. One thing to remember with the Unsharp mask effect is less is more, a lot more. If I come up here to the radius and crank it up to something ridiculous like 50, you can readily see that the type of sharpening this is introducing to the image is not aesthetically pleasing. It looks very, very strange. So just be mindful when you're changing the amount and the radius. Less is more. I'm actually going to dial it back down to 30. And I'm going to change the radius here to 7. You get a much greater sense of the effect if I zoom in to 100%. And I'm going to turn the unsharp mask off. I'm going to turn it back on. And immediately in high contrast areas like these rocks, you can see the sharpening that it's bringing into the image. We have a lot greater flexibility with this because we've shot our photos in camera raw. Go ahead and save it. Command S or Control S on a PC. Go ahead and close the Effect Controls window. And come down here to Bits per Channel or BPC. Go ahead and click on it. And change it to 16 bits per channel. And hit OK. You're not going to notice this right off the bat, but a 16-bit per channel image is much greater quality than an 8-bit per channel image. You're getting a ton more color information, and we're taking full advantage of the photos that we've shot in camera raw because they are in fact 16 bits per channel. Come up here to Composition. Hit Add to Render Queue. The first place you want to go is your Output module. As you can see, it's on lossless right now, which is actually an animation codec. If you wanted to create your own preset, say for ProRes 422HQ, you'd come to Video Output, Format Options, Compression Type, ProRes 422HQ, and now you can see it says based on lossless. It's not actually using that animation codec, but rather ProRes 422HQ. If you wanted to create your own preset, all you do is click on the drop-down menu, come down to Make Template, and then you could name your own preset. I don't need to do that though, so I'm going to hit Cancel. I'm going to come down here to ProRes 422HQ. And the next place you're going to want to go is Output To. This is where we decide where our time lapse is going to go. And I already see that it's chosen my time lapse folder, so I'm just going to go ahead and hit Save. I'm going to go ahead and save my project again, Command or Control S. If you're on a PC, I recommend at this point hitting the caps lock button. Once I click anywhere in my composition, it shows me that the preview render here has been disabled. When you're rendering, you don't want anything hogging your resources more than it has to, so disabling that preview render is going to save you some time, and if you're on a PC, the next step is to just hit render. If you are on a Mac, I'm going to show you a different way to render your compositions. And this applies to more than just time-lapse. This applies to motion graphics. Anything that you do in After Effects should be rendered in the way that I'm about to show you. So make sure you saved your project. Go ahead and quit After Effects. The next thing you're going to want to do is open up Terminal. If you don't have Terminal down here like I do, just come to Applications, Utilities, Terminal. Come back over to Finder, go Applications, After Effects, and I want you to find AE Render, which is in the main folder. AE Render is actually responsible for rendering your After Effects compositions. So go ahead and click drag over here to Terminal, go ahead and let go, and then come over to Terminal, type -project, one space in between here, and here. Come back over to Finder. Go ahead and find your After Effects project. Same thing, click, drag, let go. Go ahead and hit enter. Once Terminal gets started rendering, you don't need to do anything else. Just make sure that all these different properties you had are what you actually wanted for your After Effects composition. If not, quit Terminal immediately. Otherwise, just let it do its thing and it'll render perfectly for you. Now that our render is complete, let's go ahead and check out our time lapse.
Well, in North Carolina, way back in the hills, lived my old pappy and he had him a still. He brewed white lightning till the sun went down, then he'd fill him a jug and he'd pass it around.
With that, we've come to the end of this tutorial. I hope you use this as a good starting point for your workflow in time-lapse photography. Many thanks to Eric Kessler and Kessler Crane for sponsoring this video and for even just suggesting that I do a revised edition of my original tutorial. If you've never been there, I definitely suggest that you check out KesslerU.com. A great deal of content on the website does revolve around Kessler Crane products, but it goes much further than that. It's a great resource for filmmakers, so I definitely recommend that you check that out. Thanks for watching. This is the Red Owl, signing off. Hoot.
Mighty, mighty pleasing, pap is corn squeezing. Ooh, white lightning. Well, a G-man, T-man, revenues too, searching